I'm not paranoid. Okay. So half of you are here. That's actually pretty good for the last day before spring break.
It may be a game thing for Hannah. I don't know. She would usually say something about it, but.
No, I got an email from her this morning, and yeah, she explained why she was not be here. But yeah, so you don't have to do anything for next week, right? You can just take it easy, at least as far as this class is concerned, for a few days. But yeah, I am going to want you to complete the vocab quiz by 11:59 p.m. the Sunday right before we come back, right? So get it done by the 20th. It'll open up tomorrow morning. You'll have the full week to do it. And when we come back, we're going to be reading T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Did we do that when you were in Brit Lit too?
I feel like we did.
I know that you that you did.
It seems extremely familiar, and I have good associations with it.
Okay, well, good. All right, at least one of you does then. That's
Yeah, that makes one of us.
okay. So we may as well just kind of jump right back into Katherine Mansfield. Now, if we don't use the whole 75 minutes, we don't have to. So what y'all think about the Bay? How'd this go for you?
I got really confused,
Okay.
and then I figured it out, and then I got a little bit more confused, but I think I figured it out.
Okay, so let's start with what got you confused. What was confusing about this?
I don't know. It threw me off at the very beginning, talking about the sheep and the shepherd, and then we just jumped straight into these two guys bathing in the ocean, which the whole bathing in the ocean thing was really weird.
Bathing. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, bathing just, it just means they're just going swimming, right? They're not actually taking a bath in the ocean.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah.
I
mean, even today we call it a bathing suit, right? It's, yeah.
The terminology was just off.
Okay.
I don't know.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, so let me explain kind of what's going on with the shepherd. There are a couple of things actually going on here with that kind of beginning sequence. Okay. What's your idea, Bree?
Well, sheep just kind of follow around and do the same thing every single day.
Yeah.
And the people in the story kind of seem to be doing the same thing.
Okay. So yeah, we tend to associate, right, being a sheep. Yeah. If we call someone a sheep, we mean that, right, they're a follower, right, or they're uncreative, they're unimaginative. And what do sheep need to keep them in line?
A sheepdog or a shepherd?
Yeah, a sheepdog or a shepherd, right? So we've also got a clear hierarchy here. The sheep, the bottom of the hierarchy, appear first, right? And then after the sheep, we get the sheepdog. And then after the sheepdog, we get the shepherd. And this is a story, I think we'll figure out as we kind of work through it, that is very much concerned with hierarchies of various kinds, like both hierarchies of social class and hierarchies within different social classes and social groups, right? So, for example, we see hierarchies even among the children. We see that among the girls, right? It seems like Isabel is the oldest, and she bosses the other two around, and has no patience, like for the youngest sister Lottie, who can't climb over the turnstile by herself and things like that, right? And yet when they're with the boys seem to take charge, and the girls, even Isabel, follow along, right? So there are gender hierarchies, there are class hierarchies, there are even these kind of animal world hierarchies, right? Now the other thing that's going on with this scene, I want to draw your attention to what's going on between the dog and the cat. If we look on page 6. Bah, bah, the sheep spread out into a fan. They were just clear of the summer colony before the first sleeper turned over and lifted a drowsy head. Their cries sounded in the dreams of little children, who lifted their arms to drag down, to cuddle the darling little woolly lambs of sleep. Then the first inhabitant appeared. It was the Burnells' cat, Florrie, sitting on the gatepost, far too early as usual, looking for their milk girl. When she saw the old sheepdog, she sprang up quickly, arched her back, drew in her tabby head, and seemed to give a little fastidious shiver. Ugh, what a coarse, revolting creature, said Florrie. But the old sheepdog, not looking up, waggled past, flinging out his legs from side to side. Only one of his ears twitched to prove that he saw, and thought her a silly young female. Now, what happens in this very same spot at the end of the story?
What's her name? Beryl is almost kidnapped or...
Taken behind a bush by...
Yeah, this guy, Harry Kember, tries to take Beryl behind a bush. Yes. Miss Beryl Fairfield, yes. And Mr. Harry Kember. Yeah, he tries to convince her to go behind the fuchsia bush with him. And it's a very similar kind of interaction, right, to the dog's interaction with the cat, right? And, you know, the two kind of both attract and repel each other. So a lot of what we see in this story is this kind of mirroring as well of individuals and of situations. So does that clear up some of what you were confused about, Bree? Were there other things that y'all thought were a little confusing here?
I thought the terminology was confusing, but
Yes,
I
I
figured
think
that's just 1910s, 1920s lingo.
Yeah, and I mean some of the, I think some of the Britishisms we're probably a little used to by now, but what's going on here is that there's also a lot of New Zealand specific slang and terminology here as well. Like for example, when we're told, when we're given kind of like the layout of the summer colony here, this little town at the bay, we're told that the milk girl, Layla, lives in a where. So where is a Maori word for hut. So what this is indicating about the milk girl, since no one else in this town seems to live in where, right, is not only is she part of like the working class that lives on the outskirts, but also that she is part of the indigenous population of New Zealand that's been displaced by these. You know, I think it's also interesting that the main body of the town is referred to by Mansfield as the summer colony. Right, and this kind of works on two levels, right? On the one hand, the tourists visiting the summer colony are all, you know, literally they're colonists, right? But because this is a tourist town, the middle class residents, like the Burnells and the Trouts, and the Samuel Josephs and the Harry Kembers, right? They're all also only temporary residents.
Yeah, I did find it strange that there was a shepherd in what seemed like a vacationer's area.
Yeah. Well, and he's not on vacation, right? He lives here. So I think when we spend time in tourist towns, we often do sometimes forget that there are people who live here all year round. And that they might kind of get a bump in the local economy when everybody comes to town, like say Panama City Beach or whatever, right? But there are people who do live there and have to make their living there all year round, doing normal things, like in this instance, herding sheep, or delivering milk, or running a shop.
I do have a question,
Yeah, shoot.
but I'm not sure if it's relevant right now.
No, go ahead.
I don't know, Nick, if you got confused by this. Who's related to who and how with the whole marriage thing?
That was a little
Oh, okay.
Burnell, like Beryl's
Okay.
Burnell's sister-in-law,
Mhm.
but
Uh-huh.
Trout is the brother-in-law, but they're different names.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah.
Okay,
so
so
yeah.
I'll let you
those,
explain.
yeah. So Jonathan Trout isn't anyone here's blood relative. Okay. So let me actually. I'll try, see if I can map out a family tree here for you.
I don't know if that's relevant, but it confused me quite a bit for a moment.
Okay.
There's a lot of names thrown at once.
Yes.
Yes.
Different titles.
So yeah, Mrs. Fairfield, who isn't given a first name. She's just Mrs. Fairfield or Grandma.
Or mom.
Or mom, yeah, or mother, yes. Is the mother of Linda Burnell and of Beryl Fairfield. Linda is married to Stanley. And they have 4 children. Isabel, Kezia, and Lottie are the daughters. And a baby boy who remains unnamed here, right? Although, like, the Burnells are, because this is autofiction, as we discussed last time, the Burnells are essentially an analog of the Beauchamps, Katherine Mansfield's own family. And Kezia is the Katherine character. And the baby boy is then the kind of stand-in for her brother Leslie, who we talked about last time. Now, Stanley also apparently has a sister, right, who doesn't appear. And this sister is married to Jonathan Trout. And they have 2 sons who are given the rather imaginative names Pip and Rags. So this is the family that we're dealing with here. And then, yeah, this is actually, as we're looking at it here, this is actually a pretty large number of people for the story to center on. And like many of these people are perspective characters here at one point or another, right? We get, Linda is a perspective character, Beryl is a perspective character, so is Stanley, so is Kezia,
The baby boy has
so is Jonathan.
lines.
Yeah, the baby boy, and I think the baby boy is more kind of like, what he says is kind of being attributed to him by his mother.
Mhm.
It's really kind of more from all taking place from Linda's perspective.
I felt like there was a lot to unpack in that scene, though.
There is, yeah.
There's a lot going on there.
Yeah. We have a mother who is largely disinterested in her children for various reasons.
I was
right?
looking back at one of the reading questions
Uh-huh.
during that scene. I thought
Yeah.
There was a lot there.
And at the same time, like, her sister, who is unmarried, is desperate to be somebody's wife, right? Now, as we're looking at, kind of the other people in the colony, right? We can kind of divide them up by social class here as well. So the other middle class vacationers here, the people of the Burnells and Fairfield's own class, right, include the Samuel Joseph's family And you'll note, right, that by and large, the convention here seems to be, the family, they're not just the Josephs family or the Burnell family or the Trout family. They're the Stanley Burnell family or the Jonathan Trouts or the Samuel Josephs, right? The husband's name, even if the husband doesn't appear or isn't around, seems to always be assigned to the whole family. And the Harry Kembers, right? We have no idea, for example, what Mrs. Harry Kember's personal name is, right? Although I think there's another reason for concealing that, which maybe we'll get to in a minute when we talk about that weird scene between her and Beryl on the beach. Now, in terms of working class residents or lower middle class residents, right, we have the shepherd, Mrs. Stubbs, the shopkeeper, Alice, the maid, and there's also mention made of the Harry Kember's servant Gladys or Glad Eyes, though she doesn't actually appear. And I think we also need to pay some attention to the animals here as well. There's a lot more attention paid here than usual to the perspective of animals in this particular story. There's even that scene where the children are all pretending to be animals while they're playing that card game. Right, so in addition to the aforementioned sheep and Wags the sheepdog, we've got Flory, the Burnell's cat, and the Trout's dog, Snooker.
And the shepherd's dog.
Yeah, Wags is the shepherd's dog.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. He's only named about halfway through that scene, yeah. So this is a pretty large number of characters to center a roughly 25-page story on, right? And to what extent, so we've mapped out who these people are now and how they're related to each other, right? To what extent is this a quote-unquote story, the way we tend to think of a story? What features of a story does this seem to us to maybe be missing?
It kind of reminds me of As I Lay Dying, just how disjointed the story is. It kind of goes from one place to another. Okay, yeah, it's like Faulkner in that it's a little bit disjointed and it shifts from perspective to perspective, right? Although Faulkner typically writes in first person. Right, yeah. And Mansfield has a tendency more towards free and direct discourse. What were you going to say, Lee?
I was just thinking that it's more of a account of what happens during someone's daily life rather than an actual story with a plot line and like a purpose or a conflict.
It reminds me of an anthology.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's just like a series of distinct episodes that happen to the same people, right?
It's kind of like a TV series and you're seeing snippets of different episodes here and there.
Yeah.
Like one where you know what's going on because you walk by the TV and you catch pieces of it, but you never actually sit down and watch it. Yeah, and here, because we keep like getting, we're sitting on different people's shoulders in each scene, right? We're getting sometimes even the same incident from different perspectives, right? So like, for example, when the children see, Jonathan Trout sitting with Linda, having that conversation near the end of the story, but they're all in they're in the shed playing cards. They're like, oh, the adults are doing a thing, but we're excluded from it. And then we see the same scene from the perspective of those same adults, right? I think that lack of a conventional story structure, I think, is something that is typically modernist, and it's something we saw a little bit of in Joyce as well, right? The stories in Dubliners often fail to
resolve in any kind of normal way. They look like they're on a kind of normal trajectory where there's going to be some big thing that happens at the end, and then that thing doesn't happen, right? But I think that what we have here is a slightly more kind of radical departure from the conventions of Victorian fiction. We're going to see more of this sort of thing with Virginia Woolf. But it's a different way of trying to represent reality. And have either of you read Victorian novels? Have you read like Dickens or Anthony Trollope or George Eliot?
They sound familiar.
Okay.
I've read what you've assigned.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think did we I don't think we did A Christmas Carol when you were in Britlet too with
I
me.
wish we would have.
But I think yeah.
Why didn't I
You
get
did.
the fun one? That's not fair.
Well, because I assigned you something else. I do revise my syllabi from time to time, you know.
I remember, what was it? Something with an albatross.
Something what?
The guy with the albatross.
The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner is what you're thinking. Yeah. So that's
before Victoria.
Yeah, that's romantic. Yeah, so I think 1798 is the year that's first
That's what I
published.
remember.
Yeah. Okay, I hope it's not the only thing you remember, but
No, it's just the one I wrote the most about.
fair enough. Okay, so we often call the fiction of the Victorian period realist, but I think that that's actually a kind of misleading designation for a couple of reasons. So when we talk about Victorian realism, here's what we usually mean. So Victorian realism is largely concerned with building a plausible social world. We usually have middle-class characters and these characters have plausible motivations and psychologies. Right? They do things for reasons that make sense, right? Rather than these are things that need to be, that are determined by the needs of the plot. You also typically have in a Victorian realist text, this is why A Christmas Carol actually isn't realist, even by the Victorian definition, only events that could plausibly happen, right? You have what we would call a realistic representation of objective reality. And I think that that's the key difference between Victorian realism and what the modernists are doing, is that Victorian realism is concerned with objective reality, right? With what's going on outside of the self. So while, a character in, say, a George Eliot novel might have a plausible psychology, you don't usually spend a lot of time in that character's head. You're looking over their shoulder, you're following them around, watching them do things. But yeah, these novels are mostly concerned with objective reality, and they tend to be more kind of action-oriented. Yeah, you take a novel like, say, like Oliver Twist, right? Like it's not so much concerned with what Oliver is thinking and feeling, and much more concerned with what he's doing and what's happening to him. And there's often a level of narrative distance from the characters, right? We have these kind of omniscient narrators who stand outside some distance from the narrative, describing the action to you, right? A lot of this stuff kind of goes away in modernism, right? So it's modernist fiction is still attempting to represent reality. In fact, it's trying to do so in a way that it considers more realistic than quote-unquote realism. But modernist fiction tends instead towards subjective experience. It's much more inward focused and much less action oriented. It's not so much about what happens to a character as it is about how that character perceives and processes their experiences, right? So in that sense, it's actually similar in a lot of ways to Romanticism. There's one thing I hope you all remember from Bridlet too, is what the real content of Romantic poetry usually was, right? Was it about loving trees and nature and shit?
Not necessarily, no.
Yeah, it's about thought, right? Trees and nature and shit are important only because they are catalysts to thought. And so your typical Romantic poem is really more about the speaker mulling something over in his head than it is about whatever object he's ostensibly looking at, right? And modernist fiction tends to work the same way. It's much more focused on the inner life and the subjective experience of a character than it is about objective reality or about action. And that's why the structure of a story like this might seem so strange to us. Because what we're getting are these subjective impressions of all of these. And can we say that the Burnells don't occupy a plausible social world?
Absolutely, they're vacationers.
Yeah, I mean, this actually all seems very real, right? Or at least very plausible. They're middle class. They have plausible motivations and psychologies, right? They meet most of the definitions for Victorian realism, but nothing much happens in this story. It's not action-oriented. We spend a lot of time instead not quite inside the heads of the Burnells and their associates, but very, very close to their thoughts, right? Okay. So with that in mind, let's look a little bit more closely at how this social world is structured, right? So we've already kind of made some notes here about class here, right? And what's one way that we can tell what class someone belongs to and kind of where they rank within that class?
Well, the middle class seems to be the middle class vacationers at this New Zealand island or wherever they are in their bathing suits and they're at the bay.
Yeah, and there's a fence around the beach, right? So clearly, like the beach isn't public property. So that's kind of actually like walled off from the locals. That's for the vacationers, right? What else can we see? What else can we see? So some of it's behavior, right? The vacationers are primarily there to enjoy themselves, although Stanley clearly is still going into the office while the family's on vacation. What else do we see? Like, for example, if we look at Alice the maid on her day off, what do we notice about, like, say, for example, Alice's behavior and her pronunciation?
She seems to question things. She seems to try a little bit too hard to seem more proper.
Yeah, even though the person she's going to visit, Mrs. Stubbs, is someone kind of in her own class category. we see Alice doing a couple of things, both with language and with her actions, right? That she refers to as kind of keeping up her manners. Right, so if we look, for example, on page 24, right? Alice was welcomed so warmly that she found it quite difficult to keep up her manners. They consisted of persistent little coughs and hems, pulls at her gloves, tweaks at her skirt, and a curious difficulty in seeing what was set before her or understanding what was said. So why is she doing these things? Why is she putting all this on?
Because she wants to be associated as being of a higher class.
Yeah, she's imitating what she thinks the Brunels and the Fairfields are like, right? Her manners are largely imitative. Now, one way you can often tell a working class character in a British story or poem or novel has to do with the way they pronounce certain words, right? So the typical working class pronunciations are things like people will drop H's at the beginning of words. Or they'll interpose R's where they don't belong. Right, so the typical working class language signifiers are the dropped H and the interposed R. And also a tendency to drop G's at the end of words. So like if you get an ing word, right? You might say hoppin' or oppen instead of hopping, right? Now what we see Alice doing instead is over-pronouncing G's at the end of words, and even kind of putting them in places where they don't belong, right? For example, oving, right? She's assuming because it ends with an N, right? Or she would say it with an N sound, that she must have to put a G on the end of it, right? So, oving, where's
You do voters.
Voters, well, and that's Mrs. Stubbs, right? So Mrs. Stubbs does all of these things, right? She drops H's, she sticks R's in where they don't belong, and she drops G's at the ends of words. But Alice tries to sound like she is upper class by over-pronouncing G's. Like page 26, right? Freedom, Alice gave us loud, silly little titter. She felt awkward. Her mind flew back to her own kitching. Right? Ever so queer, she wanted to be back in it again. So yeah, so we have in Alice a kind of clumsy social climber, right? Now what about if we're looking at let's stick with the women here for a minute, right? And let's maybe take a closer look at Linda, which I think Bree, you indicated that you'd like to think a little bit about the scene in which Linda is by herself with the baby, right? So what's weird about that scene? What did you find interesting about it?
Well, she obviously has a distaste for children and a somewhat distaste for the person that her husband has become versus the person that he was when she married him.
Okay.
And she's very upset with how that has happened with her life, and she kind of just wants to, like we were talking about last class, smell the flowers. She just wants to be left alone to sit in the sun and smell flowers and do whatever she wants, but she can't because she has all of these responsibilities and obligations.
Okay.
And I feel like it could be argued that she's suffering from some form of postpartum depression towards her youngest son. I assume that she felt that with all of her children.
Yeah,
because of her distaste towards them.
Yeah, she pays no attention to the girls at all, right?
I think there is a small part of her, though, that feels some level of caring or tenderness towards at least the baby boy, because we do see that moment where she feels that tenderness at his confidence with the imagined conversation in her head between her and him, but she stomps it out. Almost as soon as we see it, she's shutting it down.
Does she shut it down or does he?
Well, he turns away from her.
Yeah, page 20, right? Just as she's making the connection, right? She says, she breathed in a small whisper to the boy, "Hello, my funny." But by now the boy had forgotten his mother. Right? There's that moment of potential connection there, and then it's missed. And I think it'd be interesting to compare that to what she's thinking about as she's looking at the flowers at the beginning here, right? Page 18, top of the page, right? Each pale yellow petal shone as if each was the careful work of a loving hand. The tiny tongue in the center gave it the shape of a bell. And when you turned it over the outside, it was a deep bronze color. But as soon as they flowered, they fell and were scattered. You brushed them off your frock as you talked. The horrid little things got caught in one's hair. Why then flower at all? Who takes the trouble or the joy to make all these things that are wasted? It was uncanny. Is she really talking about flowers here? What's she really thinking about?
Life.
Her wasted potential, maybe?
I think she's also thinking about children, right? The horrid little things got caught in one's hair and you brush them off your frock, right? They always want something from you. They're always clinging to you.
They always pull your hair and want your food. And I worked in a nursery for a few years. It's rough.
And anybody who's spent any significant amount of time around small children knows that children are tiny sociopaths, right?
Yes, 100%. I've seen a child tear the head off a doll with no remorse. It's terrifying.
But the horrid little things she's thinking about here are not flowers at all. She's thinking about children. And, she talks, later on about her dread of having children. And I think we might want to think here a little bit about why she dreads having children. What else is she thinking about before she really starts to get into the stuff about children a little further down the page? What is she remembering or imagining?
Times with her family, like with her father?
Yeah. Now she sat on the veranda of their Tasmanian home, leaning against her father's knee, and he promised, "As soon as you and I are old enough, Linny, we'll cut off somewhere, we'll escape. 2 boys together. I have a fancy I'd like to sail up a river in China." Linda saw that river, very wide, covered with little rafts and boats. She saw the little yellow hats of the boatmen, and she heard their high, thin voices as they called, "Yes, Papa." But just then a very broad young man with bright ginger hair walked slowly past their house, and slowly, solemnly even, uncovered. Linda's father pulled her ear teasingly in the way he had. "Linny's beau," he whispered. "Oh, Papa, fancy being married to Stanley Brunel." So, why does this memory interpose itself here?
She's giddy about Stanley at the point, or at that point. Or is she meaning that
I think it goes more back to
ironically?
that relationship that she had with her father.
Okay.
Because he calls her.
Yeah, what's
Why does
weird
he
in the
call her
language
his
there?
son?
Yeah, he says 2 boys going off together, right?
I wonder if he's
refers to them as 2
forgetful or if he
boys.
has some form of Alzheimer's, or maybe he wanted a boy.
Well, think about what he's suggesting they go do, right?
They go off and travel.
Yeah, they're going to go off on an adventure, right? And in the late 19th century, in Europe, or in European-derived cultures, do little girls go off on adventures?
No.
Yeah, the whole very idea of adventure, even adventure stories, right, is gendered. And because she's a girl, what is Linda's lot in life?
To get married and have children.
Yeah.
And she hates that, and she resents her children because it's her lot in life, and she can't go on adventures because she's supposed to have children.
Yeah. Very good.
So it hit me hard.
Yep. And then and I think it's meaningful here that Stanley Burnell is the thing that interrupts that conversation with her father in her memory here, right? Even as she says she does love Stanley, right? Does she seem to be happier when he's around or not around?
Everyone in the story seems to be happier when the men are not there.
Yeah, especially Stanley, right? If we, I think it's part 3 here. After Stanley has gone for his morning swim, which I do want to unpack a little bit as well, because I think that says something. It's important to compare Stanley with Jonathan, because both are representative of different modernist attitudes towards time. But yeah, if we look in section 3 here, and Stanley's behavior throughout this, kind of starting with page 9. Beryl was alone in the living room when Stanley appeared, wearing a blue serge suit, a stiff collar, and a spotted tie. He looked almost uncannily clean and brushed. He was going to town for the day. Dropping into his chair, he pulled out his watch and put it beside his plate. "I've just got 25 minutes, he said. You might go and see if the porridge is ready, Beryl?" "Mother's just gone for it," said Beryl. She sat down at the table and poured out his tea. "Thanks," Stanley took a sip. "Hello," he said in an astonished voice. "You've forgotten the sugar." "Oh, sorry." But even then, Beryl didn't help him. She pushed the basin across. What did this mean? As Stanley helped himself, his blue eyes widened. They seemed to quiver. He shot a quick glance at his sister-in-law and leaned back. "Nothing wrong, is there?" he asked carelessly, fingering his collar. So, what do we understand about Stanley just from this short scene?
He's entitled.
Yeah, he feels entitled, right? Is there any particular reason Beryl should have put his sugar in his tea for him?
No.
But he expects that she's going to do it, right? And he's genuinely confused when she doesn't, when she just passes the sugar bowl over to him and lets him do it himself, right? He assumes there's something wrong with her, that she's upset about something. What else do we notice about him here? What's the first thing he does when he sits down?
He puts his watch down and says, "I only have this much time. Go
Yeah.
get my food."
Yeah, he's obsessed with time, right? He has this weird kind of fixation with time. And he expects everybody to conform to his schedule and to help him enact it, right? He's also like, what's the other thing that gets him upset before he leaves?
That no one cares where his cane is.
Yeah, he's lost his stick, right? Which, I mean, like, he seems to be an able-bodied, relatively young adult man, right? He probably doesn't need a cane to walk. But, like, the fact that he can't find his stick makes him angry, right? If we look on page 10, towards the bottom of the page, right? Stanley dashed into the bedroom where Linda was lying. "Most extraordinary thing. I can't keep a single possession to myself. They've made away with my stick now."
And when she doesn't care, he walks off without saying goodbye, punish her.
But that bothers him all day as well, right? That he didn't follow this particular social convention, right? He left the house without saying goodbye. And it's been making him feel bad all day. So there are a couple of ways we might read that, but I think, like, how do we read this, his problem with the stick? Why is he upset about the stick?
Because no one cares.
Okay, yeah, I mean, nobody else cares about the stick, right? But what is he insisting on as he's talking to Linda?
That he doesn't have anything for himself, but in reality, she has the same problem.
Yeah. So he has this very strong notion of private property, right? That stick is mine. And none of you should be touching it or moving it or messing with it. He seems to feel kind of the same way about the ocean, right? When he gets out there and he thinks he's first, and he sees that Jonathan was already out there, he's pissed off, right? You know, he's pissed off at someone else for getting up earlier than he did and getting into the water first, right?
It's also his brother who always seems to not really care about time until that 1 section later.
Yeah. And yeah, maybe we shift there now, right? I'm going to explain to you a little bit about a theory of time that's really influential in the early 20th century. It comes from the work of a French philosopher by the name of Henri Bergson. And Bergson essentially argues that there are two different ways to think about time. The first he calls long. And long is objective time. So it's measurable. It's linear, and it's divisible into distinct units. So this is the time of the calendar, of the clock, of the railway timetable, of the factory, so on and so forth, right? Now, he opposes to this an idea that he calls durée, which in French means duration. And durée is subjective time. Right? It's focused on your lived experience. It's nonlinear. Right? Much like this story is non-linear, right? I mean, we do, on the one, we get to the end of the day, but at the end of the day, we're back in a very similar situation to what the story opened with, just with human beings rather than animals. And it's also always colored by memory. Right? So for Bergson, your experience of a particular moment cannot be separated from memory. Right? Your memory is always going to color how you're experiencing a particular moment. And his bigger argument is that reality, capital R reality, can only be understood through intuition and lived experience, not through abstract reason. So I think we probably already have a sense of how one would do a Bergsonian reading of these two particular characters. Right, one of whom I think is clearly associated with long with objective time, and the other is associated with durée, with subjective time. But let's do it anyway, right? So, which of these two men would we associate primarily with long?
Stanley.
Yeah, this is absolutely Stanley's realm, right? He wants to be first, measurably first, right? He's obsessed with his watch, and he's obsessed with, with his things and his property, right? So the normal, quote unquote, bourgeois businessman and householder Stanley is associated with long, which would mean that Jonathan is much more closely associated with the idea of durée. Kind of living from moment to moment rather than trying to measure the moments, right? So let's kind of look at how this plays out on page 8 here, right? As the annoyed Stanley is thinking about his brother-in-law here. He says, what was the matter with the man? This mania for conversation irritated Stanley beyond words. It was always the same. Always some piffle about a dream he had, or some cranky idea he got hold of, or some rock he'd been reading. Stanley turned over on his back and kicked with his legs till he was a living waterspout. But even then, I dreamed I was hanging over a terrifically high cliff, shouting to someone below. You would be, thought Stanley. He could stick no more of it. He stopped splashing. Look here, Trout, he said. I'm in rather a hurry this morning. You're what? Jonathan was so surprised, or pretended to be, that he sank under the water, then reappeared again blowing. All I mean is, said Stanley, I have no time to fool about. I want to get this over. I'm in a hurry. I have work to do this morning, see? Jonathan was gone before Stanley had finished. Pass, friend, said the bass voice gently, and he slid away through the water with scarcely a ripple. But curse the fellow. He'd ruined Stanley's bathe. What an unpractical idiot the man was. Stanley struck out to sea again, and then as quickly swam in again, and away he rushed up the beach. He felt cheated. So how does Jonathan ruin Stanley's swim?
By being there.
Okay, on one hand, simply by being there, yeah. Stanley wants to enjoy this by himself, and he wants to be first. And I think we can actually see some of this in like their relative status in their jobs, right? We know that Stanley makes more money than Jonathan does, even though they're otherwise of similar background and education, right? But Jonathan doesn't care about the same thing Stanley does, right? We see, for example, when Jonathan is talking to Linda, he speaks at least partly in literary quotations, right? So he's quoting Milton, he's quoting Shakespeare. We know that he is the leader of his church choir. He has all these artistic, aesthetic ideas, and that he's unhappy in his job. Whereas Stanley apparently likes his job enough that he still goes to it even when he's on vacation. So Stanley is kind of associated with conventionality, generally speaking, right? He is a quote-unquote normal middle-class adult male. And he doesn't like Jonathan because Jonathan's fucking weird, right? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I find it ironic the scene just before Jonathan shows up to talk to Linda, that Linda's thinking about how Stanley used to be more vulnerable to her. Like he's always, like Stanley now just has all his walls up, he's always obsessed about time, he always wants to be at work. But Jonathan, just like the next scene, completely opens up to her.
Yeah. Although we see, even though Jonathan's attitude to time is different, he's also not immune from its effects, right? One of the things that's depressing him, for example, is that his hair is starting to turn gray, which is, indicating to him that Stanley's idea of time, that objective linear time, that other characters as well, like characters that are associated with creativity and sympathy, I think, overall in the story, seem to be more on the Duray side of things, right? So, for example, like Kezia seems to be more generally sympathetic than her sisters, especially Isabel, and is more imaginative. But she also, when she's having that conversation with her grandmother, right, she is trying to make her grandmother promise not to die, right, in defiance of the whole the whole idea of objective time, right, that this is what happens to people. As much as Jonathan wants to resist conventional office work and office life, he also can't deny that he's getting older, right? And he seems to feel like his chance for something else has passed. But yeah, let's take a minute and look at Jonathan's attitude towards Stanley. Nick, can you read for us the paragraph that starts with Jonathan stayed a little longer in the water?
On the same page?
Same page, page 8, yep.
Jonathan stayed a little longer in the water. He floated gently, moving his hands like fins, and letting the sea rock his song. Skinny body, his long skinny body. Mm-hmm. It was curious, but in spite of everything, he was fond of Stanley Burnell. Mm-hmm. True. He had a fiendish desire to tease him sometimes, to poke fun at him, but at bottom, he was sorry for the fellow. There was something pathetic in his determination to make a job of everything. You couldn't help feeling he'd be caught out one day. And then, what an almighty cropper he'd become. At that moment, an immense wave lifted Jonathan, rode past him, and broke along the beach with a joyful sound. What a beauty. And now there came another. There was the way to live. Carelessly, recklessly, spending oneself. He got onto his feet and began to wade towards the shore, pressing his toes into the firm, wrinkled sand, to take things easy, not to fight against the ebb and flow of life, but to give way to it. That was what was needed. It was this tension that was all wrong. To live, and the perfect morning. So fresh and fair, basking in the light, as though laughing at its own beauty, seemed to whisper, why not?
Thank you. So, what do we get here then of Stanley's sense of life and of experience?
He's kind of jealous of other people who can just move along.
Or not Jonathan's idea, not Stanley's.
Well, he's kind of jealous of his brother, how he can move along through life just the way he is, but Jonathan wants more out of life.
He's very longing. He reminds me of some of the characters that we saw in Joyce's stories.
Okay. Yeah, somebody who's just kind of stuck, right? But at least here in this moment, right, he's taking a great deal of pleasure in just being in the water. And he actually says that he feels sorry for Stanley, right? That, that this poor asshole feels like he always has to be at work on time, that he's got to be checking his watch every 5 minutes, that he's always got to be on top of things, right? And he can't just, he can't just float. He can't just get into the water and float and enjoy himself, right? It has to be a competition. He has to be first. And Jonathan is kind of like, I think advocating a kind of easier life of sensation and experience, something almost like Walter Pater's notion of taking and crystallizing these aesthetic moments that we experience. But I think we get a sense in the following paragraph that this is also exhausting Jonathan, right? But now he was out of the water, Jonathan turned blue with cold. He ached all over. It was as though someone was wringing the blood out of him. And stalking up the beach, shivering, all his muscles tight, he too felt his bathe was spoilt. He'd stayed in too long. So it's hard to say firmly whether the novel kind of comes, whether or not the novel, this is just a short story, whether it comes down on an objective or subjective time, whether it argues for the
Or it argues one or the other being better.
Yeah.
I feel like it kind of argues that both have their own pros and cons. Like in either one, you can still end up feeling that pressure that you've achieved.
Yeah. Although I do feel like there is more. It pushes back a little bit more against Stanley's way of life than it does against Jonathan's. I think that at the very least, the story seems to feel more for Jonathan, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And I think we can compare this to the games that the Samuel Josephs play on the beach, right? If we look on page 13, right? The Samuel Josephs never played by themselves or managed their own game. If they did, it ended in the boys pouring water down the girls' necks or the girls trying to put little black crabs into the boys' pockets. So Mrs. S.J. and the poor lady help drew up what she called a program every morning to keep them abused and out of mischief. It was all competitions or races or round games. Everything began with a piercing blast of the lady help's whistle and ended with another. There were even prizes. Large, rather dirty paper parcels which the lady help with a sour little smile drew out of a bulging string kit. The Samuel Josephs fought fearfully for the prizes, cheated and pinched one another's arms. They were all expert pinchers. The only time the Burnell children ever played with them, Kezia had got a prize, and when she undid 3 bits of paper, she found a very small rusty button hook. She couldn't understand why they made such a fuss. So what is this little microcosm the Samuel Josephs have going on here? What does it kind of look like? Everything's organized, everything's competitive, you get a prize at the end.
The long idea of time.
Okay, yeah, it's this idea of time, right? Yeah. But what else that we might associate with this does it kind of look like? You strive and you strive and you strive and you cheat and you pinch and you fight to get ahead, and all you get at the end of it is a rusty button hook.
Competitiveness at the workplace, maybe?
Yeah, it's like a freaking job, right? Yeah, so like it seems to be arguing for the relative pointlessness of Stanley's way of life. I think it might also be useful to note here that the Samuel Josephs family were based on the family of Walter Nathan, who was the business partner of Mansfield's father. So this is a family that she's already associating with work and with business and with capitalism. There's one last thing I do want to just kind of focus on briefly, at least, before I let you go. What do y'all think is going on with the Harry Kembers?
Maybe not so much like in... wait a minute.
They're interesting.
Okay.
They're very intriguing.
I think it could be, I'm not too sure, but it said that Harry Kembers is like 10 years younger than Mrs. Kembers.
Yeah.
So maybe it's kind of a, what do you call it?
A sugar mama situation?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, because we're told that she seems to be, like the way she's described is not particularly attractive, right? Page 15, right, oh my dear, Mrs. Harry Kember's voice sounded as though she knew better than that. But then her voice always sounded as if she knew something more about you than you did yourself. She was a long, strange-looking woman with narrow hands and feet. Her face, too, was long and narrow and exhausted-looking. Even her fair curled fringe looked burnt out and withered. She was the only woman at the bay who smoked, and she smoked incessantly, keeping the cigarette between her lips while she talked, and only taking it out when the ash was so long you could not understand why it did not fall. When she was not playing bridge, she played bridge every day of her life. She spent her time lying in the full glare of the sun. She could stand any amount of it. She never had enough. All the same, it did not seem to warm her. So someone who's always lying in the sun and it never gets her warm, right? She's always cold. Parched, withered, cold, she lay stretched on the stones like a piece of tossed-up driftwood. The women at the bay thought she was very, very fast. Her lack of vanity, her slang, the way she treated men as though she was one of them, and the fact that she didn't care twopence about her house and called the servant Gladys Glad-Eyes was disgraceful. So what are the things about Mrs. Harry Kember that are unconventional?
Well, she can't warm up.
Yeah. What else? What else are we told about her that, like, what else makes people talk?
She smokes and she acts like a man.
She smokes and she acts like a man, yeah. So I think we have some of that angel in the house versus new woman thing going on here. But the extent to which Mrs. Harry Kember is conventionally womanly in any sense is also questioned in a number of ways. You know, that she acts like one of the guys, and like there's something weirdly phallic about the cigarette with the ash that never falls, right? Not to mention, like when she's out for a swim with Beryl, on page 17, right, she says, "I believe in pretty girls having a good time," said Mrs. Harry Kember. "Why not? Don't you make a mistake, myself. Enjoy yourself." And suddenly she turned turtle, disappeared, and swam away quickly like a rat. Then she flicked around and began swimming back. She was going to say something else. Beryl felt that she was being poisoned by this cold woman, but she longed to hear. But oh, how strange, how horrible. As Mrs. Harry Kember came up close, she looked, in her black waterproof bathing cap, with her sleepy face lifted above the water, just her chin touching like a horrible caricature of her husband. So I think it's significant here that the Harry Kembers are both referred to as simply Harry Kember, right? Because the two characters seem to melt into each other, at least in this particular moment. That on the one hand, Beryl is sexually attracted to the handsome young husband who tries to lure her out of the house for a little roll under the fuchsia bush at the end of the story. But she's also drawn to the unconventional wife, who in this particular moment at least looks just like the husband, right? So I think that there's, something like a kind of pull between two different kinds of life here for Beryl, right? She's not being offered the conventional bourgeois married life that her sister has. And she's kind of contemplating, I think, life as either independent woman or as somebody's lover or mistress. And I think time ties all of this together here, right? That one of the things Mrs. Harry Kember is telling her to do is not waste time, right? Seize that moment and have fun while you're young. Which Beryl then fails to do at the end of the story and runs back into the house, runs back into that safe bourgeois domestic space. So there's this kind of like push-pull between the home and family as prison and the home and family as kind of safe space that it's hard to wander out from, or that you don't want to wander out from. And that kind of general questioning of domesticity and the value of domesticity is itself pretty modernist, because it's not something it's not that the Victorians don't question it, but they don't question it in quite the same ways. All right, so do y'all have any questions about any of this?
Good.
All right, great. I'm going to give you the reading questions for Elliot, and then you may be on your merry way. Well, you can be on your merry way to theory, I guess.
Nope,
Unless you cancel. Oh,
yep,
am I the only one who actually made students show up today?
I have an 8:30 class that meets from literally only 10 to 15 minutes max, and then you still made us come.
Yeah, because I saw that Alex said that Jeff Walter could cancel, so now I'm starting to feel like a dick.
I still had advanced class this morning.
Okay.